Hi, everyone, and welcome to Web Bites. I'm Tammie Cumming. I serve as one of the co-hosts along with my colleague, David Miller. I'm serving Brooklyn College as the Associate Provost for Institutional Effectiveness, and happy to welcome you here today to join us for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Assessment.
Thanks, Tammie. I'm David Miller, and I am a professor in research and evaluation methods at the University of Florida, and I'm also school director for human development and organizational studies in education. And we are pleased today to have as our guest Dr. Gianina Baker, who is the acting director of the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NILOA, as many of us know it, and also the co-editor of a new book called Reframing Assessment to Center Equity: Theories, Models, and Practices.
Hello, I am Gianina Baker, and I currently serve as the acting director at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, otherwise more affectionately known as NILOA, as well as associate director for learning evaluation and equitable assessment at the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, also known as OCCRL, and both are located on the University of Illinois campus. So excited to have a conversation today about what we've learned and thinking about where this conversation has led us. And so the important part is, right, you're digging into it, because it absolutely will look different everywhere you go. But if you hadn't started it, I mean,
absolutely.
Well, excellent insights. This has been wonderful conversation. I look forward to seeing what you guys continue to do at NILOA and on your website and through the conferences when we run into each other and through your scholarship. Again, thank you so much. You've done so much for assessment, and we're really honored to have you here today.
Thank you. And thank you to all the authors of the chapters, to the co-editors that I was incredibly blessed to work with. This has been a really good experience for me. And I've learned so much, and hopefully we'll continue to share what I've learned with all of you. So thank you. Always had this lens toward, probably not as, I think, as evident or as explicit as we have been in the last few years. And so it's been a welcome conversation, because I think, everyone seems to have a lens toward it, but views it differently. I think that you could probably scour the internet and find, how everyone is finding different definitions of diversity, of equity, of inclusion. And so even in that space, right, we're seeing so much work being done, so much more emphasis on the work and making sure that we are actually working to attend to our students' needs. And so as we think about where we sit with this work, we hope that we inspired a national conversation around just the concepts, just that relationship between equity and assessment. If you haven't had a chance, definitely go to www.learningoutcomesassessment.org, our website, because it gives those first few foundational papers of how we were thinking about the concepts related to culturally responsive assessment. And that, was driven by our work and what we've known about culturally responsive evaluation. And so as we took off with that piece, we had so much response that we had to figure out, what do we do next, right? We knew that this was a conversation, we knew it was a topic, but I think that as people got a chance to not only share some of what they did in their classroom, their program at their institution, there was also this scholarly space that people wanted to write about. And so we tried to corral all of those resources in a way, and then we released a second paper from what we had learned from people's responses in the first paper. And so from that, we have seen a variety of frameworks that have been developed around not just culturally responsive assessment, but equity-minded assessment and what that means. People really pushing the conversation and pushing on the notions of what equity means, right? Especially in relation to assessment. And really, I think resources, much like the book, right, have come about because this conversation has just finally gotten into a larger sphere. And I think people are they're hungry for it.
That's interesting. I think that you're right. I think there's a whole lot out there. I think about all the conferences we attend and the different articles and things that we're seeing right now. But if you have a faculty member who comes in and is sort of new to the topic and says, "Gee, this is interesting. I need to get in on this. I need to start thinking about this for, I don't know, my classes, my research, my whatever, that need to incorporate more of this into this." Where would you suggest that they start that effort? There's just so much to look at now.
There is. I find new stuff every day. And, some of it is useful. Some of it, it's, that's not what we're doing. And so I've been incredibly grateful for the people that have done this work and that continue to surround me and help me think through what's next. So I would absolutely hope, right, that many of us who enter into this space find it that we want to do the work because we want to, right? It's personal. I think oftentimes if that's not there, this work fades away like everything else. And so I would hope that, the faculty that are coming into the spaces are realizing not just that I want to help my students, but I want me, right, to be developed in a way to help understand how I can better serve my students or the student populations, that we have, that better gets at our mission, that gets at our educational priorities. And so with that, we a few of the co-editors and I did a session at last year's Assessment Institute titled "Becoming an Equity-Centered Practitioner," right? And what does that even mean? And so we talked about these three pieces, right? Recognizing, disrupting, and reframing. And then within that, what that looked like. If you can, I highly recommend you go and look at that session. It was virtual and it's still free. It should still be free at the Assessment Institute's website. Again, not from this past year's, but last year's. But we really had a conversation to dig a little bit deeper. What does that even mean, right? You have to start with the recognition, right? That this is something that not only maybe you don't know much about and you want to learn more of, maybe you've been doing this work, right? And you're like, well, what's next as I'm in these educational spaces? What can I influence, right? Whether it's the classroom, the program, policies, whatever level you sit, right? How can you work to become more equity centered? So whether it's just some presentations that are out there, right, at conferences you attend or reading. I've had a ton of people thus far talk about the Reframing assessment book and how much they have enjoyed it, because depending on where they are within their journey or within the work that they're doing, each chapter provides a different lens toward it, and they can come back at a later time and read it, right? It's not written in where you have to go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3, when we were very intentional at the beginning of doing that. But we're hoping that, as you develop, right, you'll see a piece that maybe intrigues you a little bit more and you want to learn a little bit more about, Indigenous ways of knowing, or maybe taking a step into looking at what all scholarship has just been around this space, and, what are all of the different terms that are being discussed, and maybe I am doing it and I didn't know it. It was just termed in a different way. And so now that I am doing it, like, how can I better get out what I'm doing? What spaces can I talk about this? And so we've allowed some of that on our website. Again, if you go to www.learningoutcomesassessment.org, you can see some of the responses that have been given from people, some of the equity case studies from institutions where they have said that we want to highlight some of our practices. And so there, again, there's a lot of resources. There's a lot of understanding. There's a lot of education you can get out there. But what we hope most is that you see a need, right, to really want to do this work, right? We're not talking about equality, right, where you just see this equal world. We're really pushing on the notions of equity, where you're actively working to redirect resources to hopefully, fix barriers, intentionally provide meaningful support for students with the greatest need. And in that instance, right, I think that we can do some real good for our students and for our institutions.
Thanks, Gianina. Really helpful advice and some great resources that you've alerted us to the people who are watching this. And one of the things that David and I noticed, so we've put, as you're aware, we've put a team together and developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment for institutions. And what we found in the literature, as you've probably realized too, sometimes the nomenclature, people haven't defined what they mean by diversity, equity, or inclusion, or they're talking across each other and assuming what it means. So just stepping a little bit back on regarding your book, which you just talked about some of that, diversity-centered assessment, equity-centered assessment. Could you give us a summary and even a definition of what you mean by equity-centered assessment so everyone's on the same page?
And what I love is that I think if you talk to each of the co-editors, we all have a different lens of what that means and what that looks like. And that's fine, because we all come to this from different spaces. I think, you know, as we think about equity-centered assessment, we all ultimately, you know, I would say at least align in that we want to use assessment to further equity. And within that, it looks different, right? And I think, again, we probably come at this work from different angles, but I think, you know, if you start from some of those original concepts that were missing, that were driven from that original paper written by Drs. Eric Montenegro and Natasha Jankowski, right? If you're mindful of the student population that you're serving, if you're developing the tools that are appropriate for the students that you serve, if you're very intentional in using assessment results to actually improve student learning, if you use appropriate language for all students when you're developing your learning outcomes, and if you're acknowledging student voice and student feedback in the different planning processes, and I think most importantly, keeping students at the center, when you're doing that work, right, you're really working to center equity within your assessment practices. And so, again, it looks different, and which is why we are so grateful for the many institutions and case studies that people were willing to share, whether it's in the book or the website, because I think, again, if you're very intentional on who your students are and whom you serve, it's supposed to look different. And I think that, you know, if we're, it also, I guess, depends, you know, on just how you define diversity, equity, inclusion, right? The different spaces within that. But if you really think about inclusion, right, as treating people with just very different, disparate needs, but you're thinking about how they what supports they actually need to be serviced. There's a picture one of my colleagues just did in a session that we did where, you know, everyone had the same bike. And we're all used to like the apples or the fence, right? But there was one with bikes. And instead of everyone having the same bike and, you know, having to move forward or backward to adjust, instead of that, like if we think of inclusion as providing different size bikes or different ability bikes, right? That then changes the conversation, right? We're really working to center equity. And so we can stay in some of these spaces. Again, it looks different, and I'm glad to have the co-editors alongside this journey because I've learned from them, they've learned from me. If we're aligned in at least, you know, the sense that we know that we all personally have to do this work, and that, again, if assessment is used to further equity, something like a book can then blossom because there's so many different ways to do this work, but we're all doing it. I think that's an important piece. The action is the important piece.
That's interesting. I like the idea of assessment to further equity. I wrote that down when you said that. It's a nice concept there. At Florida, we've been doing something a little bit different. I just thought I'd get your take on that, and that is also just thinking about providing some guidelines for folks to think about what is fair and equitable in assessment. And that is, we got together a pretty large committee throughout that is based on the whole campus. All 16 undergrad or all 16 colleges were represented in it. And we put together a set of guidelines and a set of standards about assessment. And in fact, the faculty, the staff, the administrators, students all participated in this, and they've come up with a set of what they think is a set of standards now for thinking about making sure that their practices in assessment are equitable and fair. And I know that Brooklyn is also engaging in activities to make sure that their assessment practices are very carefully examined, and sort of trying to provide some guidelines so that people would understand what is fair and equitable. What we find is a lot of people don't always agree, but I think they are brought together by coming in and discussing and putting together some standards and guidelines. And I was just sort of wondering how that would fit in with the kind of thing you're talking about. Because I don't know, it's sort of, to me, is a little bit different approach from what you're talking about, which is going from assessment and using the assessment to further equity, as opposed to sitting down before you begin your classes and saying, what is equity, and how do I make sure that it's there in the assessment from the beginning, and whether or not the assessment practices themselves are fair and equitable. So I just kind of curious if you had some thoughts about that, and the directions we're going, and give us any sort of practical thoughts about how that fits in with the work you're doing, or directions that we might turn to.
I just want to interject one more thing, David, when you brought up, we are watching you closely, because I think what you're doing at the University of Florida is pretty groundbreaking with respect to setting an actual set of standards, as they have, they're not as formalized, I know, for educational measurement, but in assessment, I can see that this could be very, very useful. Of course, everything is driven by the context of the mission, and there's never a one size fit all, but a standard is it's something we're really watching, and we're hoping to model after you. Would love to hear what Gianina thinks about that.
In fact, the idea of it being sort of locally adapted, we built a set of standards that we thought were all ready to go, and then the governor passed a new bill, HB 7, that was not exactly where we were thinking about going with things, and so we have had probably another year and a half of review by lawyers and others within the university system before we've been allowed to release them. So it's been a very interesting process.
Yes, we have been watching Florida as well. I think, both of the institutions, both University of Florida and Brooklyn College, right, are on trend in that this is important work. We often look to, for us, just as NILOA, our historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, and our some of our other minority serving institutions, because they have been absolute beacons in this work. They've been doing this work for a while, right? Knowing who their students are, and then working to ensure that their students know and can do what they want from their graduates, and thinking about and respecting their place particularly. And so within that, I think, we still have a lot to learn. So a lot of, I think, models that are out there, that right, we've always said that with assessment, there's no one right way to do assessment. There's definitely no one right way to do this work, but you have to enter into it in some way. And so I definitely look to the work of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, OCCRL, has done a really good job on thinking about equity conscious educators and what that means. Because I think that if we don't take the moment that we have to really critically reflect on your position, your power, your privilege, even your own experiences and beliefs, right? We often then get to this, we don't often get to challenge some of those deficit-minded representations that we have of students. And instead, if we take that time to build consensus around what it is that we even mean, when we talk about even fair and equitable assessment, right? Hopefully then that allows us to get to this space of being really equity conscious. And we think of that as moving beyond just the simple awareness of inequities to actually acknowledging how specific institutional practices contribute to those inequities. And if we then, right, push on that notion, the other pieces kind of come, because oftentimes if you just jump into the work and say, we're going to create fair and equitable assessment, oftentimes people are like, what does it even mean? That's what we've at least experienced. And so we've had to take up some real steps back to getting back to that recognizing, disrupting, reframing. And then within that, different pieces start to come out that allow faculty and staff to say, I actually was doing this assessment that really did get at what students knew and could do. and I might have stopped it, or I'm still doing it, or it just doesn't work in the way that I need. And then that allows other faculty to come around and kind of give some peer review. Like, I actually did that in my class too. And I realized, with the students that we have, this particular piece really worked well. And in terms of assessing them, we know that the practices are out there. It just haven't necessarily been, highlighted and brought up in the ways that we're hoping that the book, that our website has done, other presentations. I mean, there's a whole track at the Assessment Institute for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion now. It hadn't been there before. And now all of these practices are being highlighted there at AALHE, the Association for the Assessment of Learning in Higher Education. So many places, I think, that we're just excited to see and to learn from. I'd also say, some of the, just to mention, some of the themes that we found in the book, from all of the different practices, all of the different conversations, right? There are some key pieces that I think really highlights, this work. And as you're thinking about just what you're doing at your individual campuses, right? It sounded exactly like some of the themes. And one of them, the very first one, was respect for place and context. And both of you just discussed that, right? How important that piece was. We noticed that, as people were really working to reframe assessment to center equity, that respect for place and context was probably of utmost importance, right? Whom you're serving and for, and where are you trying to get them? A clear focus on equitable outcomes. I think each of you just we haven't went that far into that in this conversation, but you did start to, I think, talk through at least a bit of that, making sure those learning outcomes particularly, right, are specific and actionable. That faculty and staff are crucial to these efforts, especially if you're trying to be equity-minded, conscious. I think that we can't do this alone. We often talk about, these efforts are faculty-led, but that doesn't mean faculty alone. And so how can we, as assessment professionals, work to support and help faculty along in their journeys, right, as they become equity-conscious educators? That there's collaboration across stakeholder groups. Again, we are often siloed in some of these spaces, but the more that we can be collaborative, the more we can work off of each other. The amounts of fair and equitable assessments that can be thought of and created, I think, it's unimaginable, and so many possibilities.
Yeah.
Another theme is that, there's a comprehensive data collection process and analysis process, that it's very outcome driven and outcome guided. We saw that over and over as we look through all the different strategies, whether it be classroom, departmental level, program level, institutional. And two more, right? Respect of student voice. Student voice was instrumental and has been instrumental. Some of the best assessment practices that we've seen are guided by our students, right? And those changes are made while the students are there, not, maybe 10 years later, but that there is this respect for it because it's followed through. And lastly, evidence-informed changes. We talk about this all the time with NILOA work, right? Ensuring that what you've seen, right, you then place appropriate changes, improvements. That way people then also are able to see, why you did what you did, and then thinking about, what comes next. And so those are just the themes that we found. And so as you're thinking about just your own processes, I hope that at least by reflecting on some of those themes, you can think about, what's next for us. And we've been doing a lot of this. Let's talk about our own work in some different ways as we have a model that seems to be working for us.
Mm-hmm. We have had a very interesting process in setting these standards, in that it's gone from a general meeting of everybody wanting to participate and talking about it as a general issue on campus, to essentially breaking it up into 4 sections where they said, assessment and equity is not the same in faculty assessment, staff assessment, student assessment while you're on campus, nor admissions assessment. And so we actually ended up creating those 4 different parts of our assessment. And then what was interesting is, after 4 groups met together and talked about those 4 pieces, they then wanted to get together and put it back together and say, what do we have in common? And the final documents is because the administration looked at that and said, but those are 4 such different offices handling that now we're back to 4 documents. I have no idea where we're going to end. I know that we have approval and had put up the student version this week. So it's actually up in the academic assessment office. It's been posted up there. And the other three were waiting for approval out of the appropriate office
I
because
can't wait. I
so
can't wait for this, the ending to this, well, I mean, continuation of this story.
it's fascinating thinking about how the local context means so much, and yet there's so much shared and yet so much different at the same time. So it's been a fascinating process.
The important part is, right, you're digging into it
Mhm.
because it absolutely will look different everywhere you go. But if you hadn't started it, I mean,
Absolutely.
Well, excellent insights. This has been wonderful conversation. I look forward to seeing what you guys continue to do at NILOA and on your website and through the conferences when we run into each other
I
and
know.
through your scholarship. Again, thank you so much. You've done so much for assessment, and we're really honored to have you here today.
Thank you. And thank you to all the authors of the chapters, to the co-editors that I was incredibly blessed to work with. This has been a really good experience for me. And I've learned so much, and hopefully we'll continue to share what I've learned with all of you. So thank you.